Story 1. The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. I found a copy in a used bookstore before traveling abroad when I was in high school, and I've read it every summer since. Story 2. A Short History of Nearly Everything by Bill Bryson. The first chapter was a little slow, dry, and I almost skipped it. From then on, it was fantastic. So good that 3 days after finishing it, I read it again. Wow, just wow. Story 3. The Count of Monte Cristo blew my mind with how brilliantly crafted it was. It significantly raised my standards on books and single-handedly caused me to despise mediocre books that try to imitate it. If you haven't read it already, I'd recommend you give it a read. Just don't get one of the shortened versions. Story 4. The Stand by Stephen King truly takes you on a journey that is hard to forget. Also, November 22nd, 63 by Stephen King is by far the best time-traveling book I have read. It's a great thought exercise on what would have happened if JFK had not been shot. In summary, Stephen King. Story 5. At university, I was assigned Frankenstein. I thought, are you kidding? I know the movie, don't need to read it. Well, I read it. It was nothing like the movie. Turned out to be a great book about responsibility, one of my all-time favorites. Story 6. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is funny, clever, and well-written. No one could turn a phrase like Douglas Adams, although Terry Pratchett came close. It is one of those books that I will reread every few years and always appreciate something new in there. Story 7. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Our teacher read it to us as a class when I was 10, then we studied it properly at high school. I got the rest of the Narnia books from the school library and raced through them all. Now I've got my own set of very well-loved books and I still read them every couple of years. I'm almost 60, so that's 50 years of loving them. Story 8. The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Book 1. The Way of Kings has a 4.66 out of 5 on Goodreads. If you enjoy fantasy novels, it is a truly epic tale. The way Brandon weaves together the various complex plot lines into a final white-knuckle crescendo is nothing short of brilliant. Story 9. The Name of the Wind and the Wise Man's Fear, which are parts of the Kingkiller Chronicles series by Patrick Rothfuss, unfortunately, were left without the third and final book. Still, it's the most engrossing stuff I've read. Absolutely delightful escapism. Story 10. This sounds basic, but I really vividly enjoyed the Hunger Games books. Felt like I was there. The movies were lacking in comparison and missed so much context. Story 11, title, It by Stephen King, kept me hooked all the way through. Loved how it transitioned between genres, making it pretty hard to describe. Hollywood obviously just focused on the horror idea, but I found the Lovecraftian science fiction elements much more interesting. Story 12, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. Lord of the Rings by J. R. Tolkien and the rest of Middle-earth as well. Small Gods by Sir Terry Pratchett. The Wizard Knight by Gene Wolfe. And then there were none by Agatha Christie. Literally everything ever written by Ray Bradbury, but particularly Fahrenheit 451, Martian Chronicles, and Illustrated Man, among others. Literally everything by Ursula K. Le Guin, but particularly the one-volume illustrated Earthsea collection. The Once and Future King by T. H. White. The Sandman comics by Neil Gaiman. The Dancers at the End of Time sequence by Michael Moorcock. His Eternal Champion cycle, while a bit uneven, is equally fantastic. Story 13. Anything by Khaled Hosseini, David Copperfield, Eaters of the Dead, for how clever it is. The Thorn Birds, Memoirs of a Geisha, A Handmaid's Tale, The Exorcist and the Sequel Legion, The Long Walk and the Stand by Stephen King. Sorry, there is no one. Story 14, 100 Years of Solitude. As a 10-year-old, I read half of it as a fairy tale. As a 20-year-old, I read 3/4 of it as a family saga. I am a 45-year-old now, and I'm going to start reading it from the beginning for the third time. Story 15. As someone with an engineering background and currently in the industry, it was great to read a piece of fiction that didn't take me out of my suspension of disbelief. Everything the main character was doing made sense and was described in a way that appealed to my engineering senses. Though even the author points out that the storm that stranded the main character on Mars isn't really possible on the Red Planet. I know it's not the best book ever, but it was the best book for me. The film, which I watched afterward, was decent but cut some of the stuff that made the book more appealing to me and changed the ending sequence a bit, which I found disappointing. Story 16, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. I honestly think if more people applied the principles taught in the book, there would be a shift in the collective human consciousness. Story 17. I've been reading nonstop for most of my life, so this is hard, but I have to say the Throne of Glass series. Never have I had a story pull me in so deeply. Never have I felt so many things from a story. It's as close to perfect as I've ever experienced. I've never reread a book or series, and I might make this my first one. Story 18, Things Fall Apart, by the great Nigerian author Chinua Achebe, is about life in pre-colonial Nigeria from the point of view of Okonkwo, a village elder. Favorite quote: "A man who calls his kinsmen to a feast does not do so to save them from starving. They all have food in their own homes. When we gather together in the moonlit village ground, it is not because of the moon. Every man can see it in his own compound. We come together because it is good for kinsmen to do so." Story 19, The Three-Body Problem by Liu Cixin is the first in a 3-book series, best described as science fiction. However, since the author is Chinese, the book is structured in a very unusual way compared to most other books. I will say, the book left an impact on me, an amazing experience, and that's what I would have said a year after reading it, before I discovered it's a series. It was so good standalone that I had no idea of that, and the other 2 books are just as great as this one. Story 20. Not the best book, but one I have absolutely enjoyed and read over and over, is Watchers by Dean Koontz. Who doesn't love a book with a golden retriever in it? Story 21, The Great Gatsby. It was the first book where I truly discovered what the American dream meant for some, and how it could probably never be attained even when others think you have reached it. It strikes a deep chord in me to not view wealth as the end-all but just a facet of life, and how to understand those who base their life around it as hollow. Things are things but nothing at the end. Story 22. The title of the book is The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. I first read it after I had surgery and had to use a wheelchair for about 2 months. The idea of people who want love trapped in deformed bodies resonated with me back then. It was lonely when I didn't have my mobility. Over the years, I feel much more connected to it because I can't make genuine emotional connections due to a mental disorder, which feels like life imprisonment of loneliness, though I'm not trapped in the body, but in the mind. Story 23. I was never so engrossed in a book as I was with this one. It made me question my sense of reality at certain times. The ending was a little disappointing, but the ride was totally worth it. Highly recommended. Story 24. Beloved by Toni Morrison. I probably wouldn't have read it if it hadn't been assigned to my United States history class. It packs a stunning dramatic punch and made me understand the evils of slavery on a deeper, more visceral level. Story 25. I've read many of John Grisham's novels, and his best in my opinion is The Partner. The reader reaches a point in this book where a possible dramatic surprise ending seems plausible, and from that point onward you keep reading to see if you're right and just can't put it down. What a true thriller. Story 26. Not a huge reader, but I really enjoyed World War Z. The writing style of someone interviewing survivors of the zombie apocalypse was really captivating for some reason. Story 27. Not particularly a book, more like an epic poetry. Paradise Lost by John Milton is an absolute classic literary masterpiece. We studied it as a part of our module in languages and literature. Still the best work written, in my opinion. Story 28. Call of the Wild by Jack London. Secondhand Time by Svetlana Alexievich. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Pillars of the Earth and Fall of the Giants by Ken Follett. L'Art de Perdre by Alice Zeniter. And more recently, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. Story 29. My dad had been begging me to read any fantasy other than the Harry Potter books for the 6th time and handed me his copy. I was 14 at the time and am autistic, so I refused to read anything I hadn't already or leave my comfort zone. I was invested from the first word to the last. Discworld is so absorbing, so fascinating, and maybe the funniest stuff I've ever read. I still have that copy. He let me keep it. I've reread it so many times. I've dog-eared the pages and sections I love the most dramatic ones or the funniest ones, so I can go back and enjoy little snippets whenever I want. And I've started my own collection of Discworld novels too. It really changed the way I consume fantasy media forever. Thanks, Dad. Story 30. A weird, mostly unknown book called A Woman of the People. A paperback book, and the writing is the best ever and really would make for a super great movie. It tells the story of a captive Texan white girl taken by a group of Plains Indians, along with her little sister. It is more like Dances with Wolves, or a mixture of the true story of Cynthia Parker. This wonderful book showcases the good on both sides of the white settlers, but also the bad. The details, emotions, and first-person narrative from Tehanita is riveting. And the same with the Indians, the good and the bad. Others, The Glass Castle, Peony by Pearl S. Buck. The Sons by Pearl S. Buck. Story 31. Choosing the best book is hard, but maybe Dubliners by James Joyce is a good choice because I think the last few pages of the final story, The Dead, are one of the finest pieces of writing in the English language. Absolutely beautiful prose. Reading it for the first time felt like a religious experience, especially with the song The Lass of Aughrim that Greta sings in the story echoing in my head. Story 32. Best for me as a person was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. It got me into reading in first grade and is, therefore, the foundation for anything I gained from reading. Most enjoyable was probably one of the books from the Art of the Adept series by Michael G. Manning. The best story would probably be The Way of Kings. Rarely have I related to any character the way I do with Kaladin. Most effect on the way I do things goes to the Reacher books. Do important things now, don't go too much for perfection, and look at things laterally are the lessons here. Also, doing paperwork in a way that they better not send this again. Story 33. Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. Oh, the beauty of it. It's not just about physical isolation, but the kind of loneliness that comes from denying who you are. What stood out to me was how Baldwin portrays the cost of that loneliness. It's a haunting reminder that the refusal to face one's truth can lead to devastating consequences. Giovanni's fate is heartbreaking, and David is left adrift, still unable to fully confront himself. The novel left me contemplating how far people go to avoid their inner truths, and how that avoidance creates a deeper, more painful solitude. Story 34. Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller, and it's not even close. Maybe it's controversial, but undoubtedly it's my favorite book by my all-time favorite writer. The only book that has made me cry for just being alive and a part of this human experiment. Story 35. I really enjoyed The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. I went in cold with zero expectations, and it was unexpectedly brutal and at times hilarious, some dark parts lightened by his use of simple people and answers. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. Unlike the book The Name of the Wind from Patrick Rothfuss, which came highly recommended to me from others, this book was so awesome. I love the quirky character, extremely powerful but humble and somewhat innocent as well. Such a good read as well. Story 36. The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Just the vibes of the book make so much sense to me. I can't describe why, but it feels so natural, unlike any other book I've read before. Story 37. There was a book I read and adored when I was probably 8 that I got from the school library. I don't remember the name or what it was even about at all. I only remember a single scene where the character was sitting on a windowsill and watching the moon. It's been bothering me so much the last 2 years that I can't remember the name. Story 38. All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. Skinny Legs and All by Tom Robbins. You would think that in the 20 to 30 years since I first encountered those books, they would have become perhaps less relevant to current times, but unfortunately that is not the case. Story 39. Hyperion. Rise of Endymion. Book 1 was amazing. Book 2 was a bit of a snore but had some good elements. Book 3 ramped things up quite a lot. Book 4 had me, a 40-year-old man at the time, absolutely bawling at the end. Story 40. With the risk of sounding tacky, I'll say Lord of the Rings. Let me explain why. It's not just because J.R.R. Tolkien was a huge nerd and created this complicated universe with complicated lore and complicated languages. Those are a sprinkle on the top for me. The real reason is because I grew up in an environment where people being rude to each other was the norm. Not just necessarily swearing, but impolite, inconsiderate, etc. In the Lord of the Rings books, the language hobbits use is ultimately polite, considerate, and even sweet. The Lord of the Rings book provides, in my opinion anyway, a quite distinct difference between light, good, and dark, bad. And Tolkien, being the linguist he was, provides that distinction in the language. This fact only changed my life, changed the way I speak, for the better. I'll read it again and again to keep this good language in my life, not to slip back to my old ways. Story 41. I can't believe it hasn't been named. Susan Eloise Hinton's The Outsiders. It probably will go down as my all-time favorite, easily the best book I got to read in school. Story 42. Watership Down was what I read at 20 years old. I could not stop or put the book down. Brave New World, Lolita, and I enjoyed so many of what Oscar Wilde wrote. Story 43. People are gonna hate me for this, but it's Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. It came to me at a time I was in a real rut and was the force I needed to get my act together. I really turned myself around from then on,